Sign up here. I guess. Will we see anybody?
So there's a chat room which I'd advise we don't go into because it will be very, very distracting. What I'm going to do, I'm going to mute that chat room so that nobody can hear that. But yeah, that's
my non-fan club already been on complaining apparently.
Yeah. Last week when we couldn't get up, there was just the live stream. The chat room was going crazy.
Send me them so I could see them.
Yeah, I'll send you the link so you can watch the video back and just scroll through the videos. There was a few disgruntled comments about the Judas Seder. Okay, so we're live. Okay, so I'm just going to check the live stream to see how many people we have in. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I will begin. Okay, so welcome to the first debate that we've had since the first live stream, since the lockdown. Wishing you all Hag Pesach Sameach. Hope your festive period was good. If you're not Jewish, happy Easter. If you're not Christian, happy Sunday. So this is the first debate of many. And the subject of today's debate is, does Progressive Judaism have an anti-Zionism problem? Now, this isn't an opportunity for denominations of Judaism to shout at each other or even Jews to shout at each other. We're one family and we have a rich history of diverse thought. The Talmud is a testament to the diversity of Jewish thought through the ages. And this debate was born out of the current state of affairs, where if you mention anti-Zionism and Judaism, the immediate association most people have is maybe Neturei Karta, Satmar, ultra-Orthodox fringe groups who are quite hostile to Israel as a Jewish state. But at least in my opinion, in reality, the far larger and certainly more vocal opposition to Zionism or the Jewish state from the religious Jewish camp would be from more progressive groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. Maybe throw a little one in, which is relevant for today. Judas have certainly come out on record with some not so pro-Israel comments historically. And so discussing this theme, does Progressive Judaism have an anti-Zionism problem, will be Rabbi Danny Rich. He's the president of the Council of Christians and Jews, the co-chair of the National Refugees Welcome Board, and a member of the Council of Imams and Rabbis. Most relevantly, he's the former senior rabbi and chief executive of Liberal Judaism UK, so very qualified to speak on this subject. And so he will be arguing against the motion, does Progressive Judaism have an anti-Zionism problem? And arguing for the motion will be Rabbi Stuart Altshuler. He's the rabbi of Belsize Square Synagogue, which I believe is an unaffiliated synagogue, but closest to the conservative Masorti tradition. Both rabbis can correct me if I've said anything wrong about them or their organizations or ex-organizations. And prior to this, Rabbi Altschuler was a professor of history and philosophy in the Jewish Studies Department of Chapman University, and he was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I believe as a member of the Rabbinical Assembly. So they're the two rabbis discussing the subject, does Progressive Judaism have an anti-Zionism problem? The format is going to be very simple. There's going to be a very quick fire round where I'll ask a handful of questions or make a handful of statements, and the rabbis will simply say agree or disagree to it. And this is so you can place them on the political Israel-Palestine spectrum, left, right, where do they sit? They may be very close to each other. They may be on opposite sides of a huge chasm. We'll find out after that very quick round. And then both rabbis will take 10 minutes to put forward their case, 10 minutes each. They will then have 5 minutes to respond to what the other person said. And then we'll open up the discussion to all of you guys in the comments. Now, as I said, this is the first of many debates. So make sure that you subscribe to us on the channel down below. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you never miss a video. And without further ado, I'm now going to very quickly launch into the quick fire round. During the Q&A, if you want to leave questions, leave them in the chat room. We'll try and keep track of it. The easiest way to get noticed is the super chats. If you haven't used YouTube before, quickly Google that, but that will make sure your comment gets noticed. But yeah, without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and launch into the actual very first part. So, rabbis, could you tell me, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so simply agree or disagree to this statement. National self-determination in Israel is the unique right of the Jewish people. Either rabbi, feel free to say agree or disagree.
Agree.
Agree.
Agree or disagree? The Jewish people are indigenous to Israel.
Agree.
Agree.
Israeli Jews shouldn't live in the West Bank unless invited by the Palestinians.
Disagree.
Agree.
Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel.
Agree.
Disagree.
Okay, that was actually perfect. There, we'll stop sharing. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so now we should have probably opened this up before we went on the live stream. But would either of you like to volunteer to go first and give your 10-minute talk on?
Well, my dear friend Stuart is a senior colleague, so maybe I should let him go first.
No, I'm not. I'll be glad to, but I would have deferred to my friend. And I want to begin with that. Just two caveats. Number one, I have a close personal relationship with Rabbi Rich. So I hope you're not expecting fireworks here. I have enormous respect for him. And it has always been that way. He was one of the few colleagues who welcomed me when I first came to London, and I don't forget. So we have a close personal bond. So we're having a discussion. We disagree, but with all the respect in the world. Secondly, I also want to state that I am the rabbi of the synagogue. I've been here in London for 9.5 years almost, and I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for my entire congregation. We at Belsize Square Synagogue, like all synagogues in our area, whether they be more traditional, observant, or non-so, have tremendous divides in our community on these issues. So I don't want anybody to think that I'm speaking for a mass of my congregation. So I'm speaking for me. And I've been around the block a long time with Israel. I have family there. My son Eitan lived there for quite a long time. Both my kids are avid Zionists. And my family was the way I was raised from my youth. So I speak with this subject with a great deal of emotions. First of all, I think it's clear from all the polls that we have seen, the registering of opinions, that there has been, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, a palpable decrease in support for the state of Israel in the past 3 decades at least, or perhaps even more so. And polls have shown very clearly that the more observant Jews are, the Orthodox community tends to be more pro-Israel, the Masorti movement is somewhere in the middle, and reform in the United States, reform liberal in this country is also has a less connection with Israel than in the past, especially with its youth. This is a fact. So the question is why this is going on. I also want to state a little bit about myself. I'm very uncomfortable with the word liberal regarding relationship with Israel. I was raised in a liberal Jewish home in Los Angeles. I was raised with those great Jewish values about the need for human freedom and dignity and care for all peoples in the world. My parents were at the forefront of charitable organizations, but at the top of their list was their involvement in Zionist organizations and Jewish organizations. I remember very well when I was a kid on Sunday morning and we were having our brunch together, that if Abba Eban or Golda Meir was on Meet the Press in the United States, we would drop everything, because that was the top of the line in our home. Israel began everything. If a candidate was not pro-Israel, that was it in our home. It didn't matter where they came from. So I want everybody to know that's where I am. The Altshuler family was one of the 5 original founders of the city of Rehovot in 1881 when they first came, and my family's still there, living in Karmei Yosef, which is a beautiful town that my family started, and we're still very close. So my roots in Israel are very strong. And I always take umbrage with this idea because we never define what liberalism means. And I'd like to share with our audience here, in the few minutes that I have, is why I think liberalism has changed and why liberalism is more associated now with those groups that are more contrary and anti-Israel. And I point to 6 things. Number 1, I believe and liberalism's changed, a growing view, I would call it a benign view of human nature. The idea that's repeated often, we're all human beings. And so therefore, because we're all human beings, we have to take cognizance of those ideals that developed in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, that we all want the same. We want an end to poverty, we want an end to displacement. And if there's violence and unrest, it means that certain needs are not being satisfied. I hear this all the time. And so therefore, this belief in progress, if you will, in the human nature becomes very important. I believe, and this is where in my study of Jewish history, and especially my many trips to the former Soviet Union, is that the left often doesn't take into account that not all people are the same and not all ideologies are the same. That there are groups of people, religious and political groups, that have very different values than what we have. Religious extremism, especially in the Muslim community, is a very real factor. There's a lot of reasons for it, but it has developed so strongly in the Middle East that it's affected our opinions and our attitudes towards Israel. And so I think that the idea of a rational discourse, that everybody wants the same, a country, territory, freedom, and human rights, has been blurred by the fact that we have negated in many ways the very real ideological foundations of the problems in the Middle East that Israel faces. Number 2, I think that liberalism tends to identify with something that was very strong when I grew up, and that is identification with the underdog. Identification with the underdog, which means that the weaker party is what the Jewish people have always been behind. And so therefore, if there's a weak party, there has to be a party of perpetrators. And so if you have a weak element in the Middle East, it means that there's a strong element in the Middle East that exploits its advantage for violence and destruction, occupation, and removing civil liberties from the occupied or the underdog group of people. We care for the other. And we see this in the media, in academia, and in the growing political left as well. The only problem that I have with that, I never mind understanding the views of the underdog, but I think we've mistaken who the underdog is in the Middle East. Despite Jewish power, and we do have a very effective military, my contention is that Israel has always been the vast underdog of the world nations as a large in its cause for freedom and security. That when Israel fights wars against terror, for example, it fights them because it needs to defend its little country that's the size of Wales and surrounded by 21 Muslim countries surrounding it. And I think that liberalism has lost, in terms of the underdog of Middle East history, who the underdog is and why they're not the underdog. And because of that, the liberal element has obviated Arab and Muslim responsibility for the problems that they have, and we all share, all human pain in the Middle East. But the culprit has been mistaken. Number 3, I think that the liberal movement, which was very different than the John F. Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey, Henry Jackson, Adlai Stevenson liberalism that I grew up with. And that there is a growing disdain for Western values. We've seen this, by the way, in the Democratic Party in the United States, which was my party, which has very often been at the forefront of condemning the United States, Western power, and concomitant to that, of course, the state of Israel, which is supported by the United States and the Western world. The values of third world countries in many ways have been proclaimed as superior to Western values. Colonialists, white supremacists, racists, Jewish apartheid, Israeli apartheid. These are the new strains of the left that we never heard in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And my contention is that Israel is the only beacon of democracy and liberal values in the Middle East, towards women, towards the gay population, towards you name it. And we've mistaken who the enemy is, in a sense. Number 4, I think there's an egocentrism involved with the left. It seems to see conflicts in the Middle East from the prism of our own value system. And I always say this: you don't live there. You don't know what you're talking about because you're not on the front lines. My family is. I hear it all the time. And these are very liberal and very humanist people. There is a deep-seated hatred for the Western values. It's involved with a lot of religion and politics. We hear this in Syria, in Iran all the time, and we've never digested the fact that there are these vast elements in that area that are totally contrary to what we believe in. For example, I hear the line, we all want the same for our children. But we don't want all the same for our children. And I'm not making, by the way, blanket comments, but we see there is a large element, especially in the Palestinian territories and especially in Gaza, that has been lauding their children for becoming suicide bombers. This is not our value, and we haven't learned that lesson. 5th, we try to make this quick, there's also a global mentality, I call it. Liberalism has been more concerned than ever before of making sure that we're accepted by the larger world. So the liberals have been much more embracing of, for example, of the global units such as the United Nations, which has been just a disease of anti-Semitism in the last 5 or more decades. We could even trace it further than that. And this is what bothers me the most, because the left should know this. In 1948, after the Shoah, the United Nations, by a legal vote, voted to create 2 states in the area, an Arab state and a Jewish state. That should have been defended by every nation in the world. 6 Arab armies attacked Israel with the intention of annihilating Israel, and the world stood by largely, except Israel got some planes, some help from France and from Czechoslovakia. But the United Nations at that time proved its corruption. It didn't stand by the one state that it created out of the growing sensitivities of the nations of the world. This is a legal case internationally, and all those wars that Israel has had to face has never received the backing of the international community. The only thing we see there is proclaiming that if Israel somehow were to give up its settlements in Judea and Samaria, that all the problems would go away. And they don't go back to 48. And then, of course, all the peace negotiations that were so close to a settlement, just annihilated by the international community. And then feeding that from Western countries so that the Palestinian Authority and Hamas could go to the United Nations and just keep beating Israel over the head with the full sanction of the international community. Those UNRWA and those refugee attempts, instead of helping those people, they kept those refugees as a festering store to promote an ideology of hatred against the Jewish state. And then I'll just finish this because we need to get to Rabbi Rich. And there's so many examples in the UN, but there's also a growing element of pro-socialism in the left movement that we didn't see in the 60s. I remember John F. Kennedy said, "We will fight every battle against the communist world." And the left is growing increasingly weird after the Soviet Union and after what we see with China and all the failed communist states. There's still an attitude that somehow this socialism, which is anti-West, is the superior way to go. And it's creating a terrible moral and historical problem for those who love Israel today. So, and there's a lot more I could have said, but we'll keep it at that. I lost you.
Amazing. I was just going to say thank you. Rabbi Rich, if you need to take longer than 10 minutes, because Rabbi Altschuler was just...
Did I? I'm sorry.
But thank you very much, Rabbi. And over to you, Rabbi.
I'll try to do what I can in 10 minutes, seeing that it's now 7:48. Let me just first of all say that what Stuart says about personal friendship is indeed true. Stuart is a great scholar and a great congregational rabbi, and whatever dispute I have with him about what he might have said or not said, this is not about personal. I do want to say another thing, that it is warming to my heart that we can actually get some civilized debate about Israel and about Zionism. Because one of the greatest challenges that I think Israel has and the Jewish community has is an inability in the community to have any sensible, rational debates. And what we end up with is extreme statements on both sides, to the right and to the left. And sometimes that's appropriate, but more often than not, it actually alienates particularly young people in the community who say a plague on both your houses. And one of the greatest challenges that Zionism faces and Judaism faces is young people saying, we're not interested in either. And so I want to put my remarks in that context, that I want our young people and our generations to be both pro-Judah, pro-Jewish, and pro-Israel. And I'll try and explain how I understand that to be. In terms of vocabulary, just let me say one other thing. I thought I was asked to speak on does Progressive Judaism have a problem with Zionism or anti-Zionism? And I just want to define a few terms, because Progressive Judaism can be progressive with a small p, progressive with a small p, and I'm not sure what that really means. Or Progressive Judaism can be the movement that I was proud to represent for 15 years as its professional head, namely the liberal and reform movement, and maybe wider. Zionism, of course, itself has many definitions, but I'm not going to waste my time on those, though we might come back to tease some of those out a little later on. I want to say that I have no Zionist yichus like Stuart has. Indeed, I come from what I would say is a classical English liberal Jewish family, which was non-Zionist. Some people would say anti-Zionist, but I certainly wouldn't say anti-Zionist. But I would say it was non-Zionist in the sense that it took up the biblical tension between universalism and particularism and came down on a particular side. And I want to explain a little bit what I mean by that. What I mean by that is, if I study the Hebrew Bible and Jewish history, and I accept that Stuart is a better Jewish historian than I am, one sees a tension between particularism and universalism. How does one protect the rights and well-being of the Jewish people, and at the same time make our contribution to the totality of God's world? And one sees it, one just picks biblical verses like, the Israelites will be a people who dwell alone on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're supposed to be a light unto the nations. And that's not necessarily intention, but very often, and it is perceived to be and may be intention. And so I guess what I want to say is that what liberal Judaism, the core teaching or a core teaching of liberal Judaism is that our responsibility to the Jewish people cannot be at the expense of our obligations to humanity. And I think that's an important starting point, because whatever liberal Judaism, progressive Judaism, whatever you call it, it was founded in Germany in the first and second decade of the 19th century, was struggling with this tension between particularism and universalism. And I'm afraid to say the enemies of progressive Judaism have either unwillingly misunderstood or deliberately, let's say worse, chosen to misunderstand how it is that the tension between those two is held by Progressive Judaism as it's held by other parties in different ways. Of course, and I'm on to point number 4 here, I think, liberal Judaism and Zionism have a common origin. They really, and by talking about political Zionism, of course, and the Progressive Judaism, liberal Judaism, they arose in the 19th century, one early and one late, one in the west of Europe and one in the east of Europe, one more religious and one more secular. But they both claimed ancient origins, and they both suggested, and I think they were, a response to emancipation. You see, the real concept of political Zionism or Progressive Judaism was not available to Jews who lived under Christian rule or even Islamic rule in the ghettos or their Islamic equivalents. Political Zionism, as I understand it, and as I think we want to understand it today, and Progressive Judaism is a response to Jews living in a new world, in a world, of course, of a European modern, what we call the nation state, which, of course, drew very consciously the idea, well, what happened to the Jewish nation state, which, by the way, we know had long disappeared not long after the Maccabean Roman period. And for all our odes to Zion and looking to the east and praying with facing a particular way, in practice, most Jews had settled to the better or to the worse in the countries in which they lived, and made a dynamic and creative contribution as a Jewish minority in those countries. That doesn't mean they lived without problems. Of course they did, in both Christian Europe and in Islamic countries. But essentially, Jewish creativity not only persisted, but grew in the diaspora. And it's important to say that when political Zionism was first established, many Jews across the spectrum, for ideological, for theological, for practical reasons, opposed Zionism. And the idea that the only people that historically opposed Zionism were the extremist Neturei Karta equivalents or Progressive Judaism is simply nonsense. In fact, the vast majority of Jews, in my view, or at least certain large numbers of them, oppose Zionism for reasons of theology, for reasons of ideology, or simply for reasons of practice. They thought it would encourage anti-Semitism and make them appear even less loyal. And so I want to nail, if I can, this idea somehow that Progressive Judaism has always had this problem differently from everybody else. And what we see in the States and elsewhere, if we look very carefully, is an evolving accommodation between Progressive Judaism and Zionism. And let's not forget that when the state was being founded, it was a great American Reform rabbi who spoke at the General Assembly in favor of the State of Israel. Classic Reform, American, what we would now call liberal. And I'm not going to go through all the dates and all the people, but just think about Judah Magnus, Stephen Wise, Abba Hillel Silver. These were people who were founding the Hebrew University in 1925. They were addressing the UN in 1947. Reform Hebrew Union College trained rabbis. And if I come just to England for a minute, ironically, it is the liberal movement in England that was the first movement to have a creative liturgy of Yom Ha'atzmaut. Service of the Heart, 1967, ironic about the date, was the first liturgy, I think, in the world, but I'm happy to be corrected, that had a formal liturgy for Yom Ha'atzmaut. I mean, that seems remarkable for a movement that's so often tainted with extreme views of anti-Semitism. And I suppose what I want to say is that liberal Judaism doesn't have a problem with Zionism if Zionism can do a number of things or be a number of things. And I'm talking about the ideology. I'm happy to talk about the Israelis and the state of Israel in a moment, but simply to say this. There are three challenges, I think, that much of Zionist thinking has for liberal Judaism. The first is, if Zionism can place Judaism at the center, not at the periphery can place religion at the center, not at the periphery of religious life, we might have a different conversation. In other words, the challenge for many liberal Jews is that we identify our Judaism as our center, as at the center of our core. And in practice, much of Zionist thought places religion at the periphery. And I daren't talk about, I'm happy to do so later on, about the state of Israel's discrimination against progressive Judaism in particular. Second, liberal Judaism has a problem with Zionism when it deprecates rather than applauds the diaspora. In other words, if we can have a Zionism which talks about the partnership between Jews who choose to live in the diaspora for whatever reason, and Jews who live in the state of Israel who are Zionist pioneers or fulfilling the Zionist dream, we could have a better relationship between progressive Judaism and Zionism. And the third is Zionism has to commit itself to building a prophetic society. I know it's a religious concept, but it has to build, has to have at its core that Zionist society must be a prophetic society. And if it did so, I think there would be less of this clash between Zionism and progressive Judaism. But above all, I think progressive Judaism, certainly in its modern manifestation, does not have a problem with Zionism or anti-Zionism. Let me add just one other comment. I don't want to respond to Stuart because, of course, we're going to have him respond, but to say something that maybe when you're talking about progressive Jews, you're talking about Jews on the left. And by the way, I represented as the senior rabbi and professional of a progressive movement, which had not everybody was on the left. There was on the left. All right. So it depends what term we're using. But if by progressive Judaism you're meaning left-wing Jews, which you may be, then even socialist inclined Jews, there are plenty of socialist inclined Jews and left-wing Jews who again have respect for the achievements of the state of Israel, don't wish to see it destroyed, indeed wish to see it to thrive, but wish it to see it thrive alongside its neighbors in a different style of relationship, acknowledging at the same time that it lives in a mean neighborhood. But ultimately, I'm going to finish on this point because I don't know whether I've done 10 minutes or not, but I think I've done exactly 10 minutes, actually. I'm going to just finish on this point. I think progressive Judaism and Zionism have in common this. They are both seeking to fulfill the second Isaiah's prophecy that Israel should be a light to the nations. And for Jews, they see that in a religious sense. Zionists see it in a statecraft sense. I don't believe that Zionists set out, and the people in the state of Israel set out to make Israel a pariah, to do things that upset people. I think the purpose of Zionism was to create an ideal state, and Judaism seeks to create, liberal Judaism seeks to create an ideal world. And to me, those things are common, not contrary. I'll stop there.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, Rabbi Altschuler, if you'd like to respond, the floor is yours.
Yeah, there are many different varieties of progressive Judaism. I'm in the Masorti branch, which is probably more of the right. But a little bit of history here. First of all, when I was a young student at Temple Beth Am in Los Angeles, with a leading conservative synagogue there, we had every year a long-standing celebrations for Yom HaAtzmaut. So I don't know the history here, but certainly the United States, the way I was raised, Israel's at the top of the list. A little bit of an historical note about the early 20th century, when Theodor Herzl started his campaign for political Zionism. And by the way, we also know that there were many different varieties of Zionism: cultural Zionism, practical Zionism, existential Zionism, communist Zionism, socialist Zionism. It is true. Rabbi Rich's point is absolutely right, which I think needs a lot of careful discussion. And that is, before World War II, generally, even in the United States, which had an influx of Eastern European Jews that were very highly identified as Jews, is that the two wings of the parts of the Jewish world, certainly in the United States, Orthodox and Reform, except for the maverick positions of Rabbi Silver and Rabbi Weiss, they were really out of step with the mainstream of the movement, which was largely against the idea of a Jewish state, both the Reform movement and in the Orthodox communities, which were much smaller back then.
Are we allowed to interrupt or not?
What?
Are we allowed to interrupt or not?
No. But wait, you'll get your turn. But in the foundation of the Masorti movement, dating back to the late 19th century, early 20th, was built upon an ideology that was set forth very clearly by Rabbi Solomon Schechter, who was one of the early chancellors of the Jewish Theological Seminary, in the belief that, yes, of course, Judaism was core to our existence, but that we were also an we were a nation, a people, with a separate history. This all began developing in Germany with the national consciousness that was raised by Leopold Zunz and Zachariah Frankel and Heinrich Gratz in his epic History of the Jews, where Jews started thinking consciously about their own national history. And with the ensuing development of anti-Semitism in the 19th century and 20th century, I'm proud to say that it was the conservative movement that had little dissent from the inception towards the idea of a Jewish state. And that's the way I was raised, and the way my parents with Eastern European immigrants were raised. Israel's the top of the list. So that's very important to my core beliefs. I'm a conservative rabbi. I accept more the idea of this what is very easy to meld, and that is the fusion of both our obligations towards the global community, but first and foremost, our obligations to keep the Jewish people alive and secure. Because like Natan Sharansky always said, the shofar is blown, and the shofar is a very special shape. But if you try blowing the shofar from the big end, you can't make any sounds. But you can affect the world by blowing the shofar from the small end. Elie Wiesel, who was a great teacher of mine, Natan Sharansky, in his fantastic book, Fear No Evil, taught us that in order for us to be an Or L'Goyim, a light unto the nations, we have to blow from that small end first. If Israel is devoured and there's no Jewish people, the medical research, the universities, the scholarship, Jewish history, Jewish culture will be annihilated, and therefore the world will suffer. I'm not in favor adamantly for a Jewish state just because I want an enclave of Jews. I want us to be a light unto the nations, but we cannot do it if we're constantly fighting for our survival. I would like to move to that next step of Zionism. But in order to get there, we have to make sure that Israel's secure and safe and proud of our history so that we can stand up to whatever we need to in order to protect it. So I wanted to just add that note. I know Rabbi Rich wants to let me have it.
I just wanted to correct one factual point, which is, of course, that before the Second World War, the Central Conference of American Rabbis had moved from its position of neutrality in 1937, by the way, to being pro. But I mean, that's not really what I want to do is try and actually create a little bit of a discussion about some things, which at least for us to reflect on. I want to first of all, I mean, if Israel is devoured, the Jewish people cease to exist. Well, I'm afraid, much as I recognize that Israel has become a center of Jewish inspiration, a center of Jewish liturgy, a center of the revival of the Hebrew language, a center for Jewish safety, a center for the Jewish calendar. All the things that are positive about Zionism. The Jewish people existed in the diaspora and survived in the diaspora and thrived in the diaspora. Now that is not advocating, and I want to be absolutely clear, this is not advocating the destruction of the state of Israel, but it is statements like, if Israel is devoured, the Jewish people cease to exist, that make some people question what actually is going on. Now, so I want to be clear. I think I have been clear what I've said, that I'm not, I support the state of Israel. My closest friend lived there. I've got family living there. So it's not that I want it to be destroyed, but it is simply, there are currently a Jewish people existing outside of the state of Israel, and that part of the Jewish people should thrive with all of the challenges and history has proved that the Jewish people can survive within their own state as they did before the Roman period, and thereafter in exile, if you like, quote unquote, until their return. But what I really want to say is more about this. It's about, and it's not directly about Zionism, Progressive Judaism, but it is about this. I think one of the challenges that I think the Jewish community has is it wants everybody to hear the Jewish narrative, but is completely unable to hear the Palestinian narrative. And what one has to try and do, I think, is to try and hold both narratives together. After all, we are descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, and if we're really to make progress in the Middle East, there has to be something about not accepting all the other person's narrative, but seeking to understand it. And therefore, not the vast majority of Palestinians are not sending their children to be suicide bombers, for example. My experience of the vast majority of Palestinians, and the surveys tell us, would want a peaceful coexistence with Israel, as most Israelis do, I think, with their Palestinian neighbors. So that now, of course, there are global terrorists. Of course, there are Islamists who claim to speak on behalf. Of course, there are idiotic others who claim to want the whole of the land and all of that. But actually, the only way, in my view, that Israel will be able to fulfill its real destiny is if it reaches an accommodation with the Palestinians. Because the challenge for many liberal Jews, and for me, is not that Israel is unkind to Palestinians, although it may or may not be. It's that what it has to do for security reasons saps its own moral energy. And therefore, the idea that we talk about Western values. Well, so-called Western values led to the Shoah. So we need to be very careful when we're talking about somehow that there are Western values which are good and non-Western values which are not good. There are Western values which are good and Western values which are not good, and there are non-Western values which are good and non-Western values which are not good. So I don't see the clash, if I can use that term, in quite such simple terms. I see two peoples, each with different historic rights to the land, each with different narratives about how they got there and why they were there, each highly intelligent, each with great ingenuity and capacity, but currently, I think in both parties, without the real leadership required to take them to the place where they need to be. And that, to me, is why the values of liberal Judaism are more important to Zionism than they've ever been before. I'll stop there.
Perfect, thank you. And what I'd like to do now is open up to questions. I've got to say, this is the hardest debate for me to chair. I've had to put my neutral hat on and to get involved myself. So as I'm chairing the debate, before opening up to the chat room, what I'd like to do is actually ask both of you a question, kind of tied into what Rabbi Rich was just saying, and one of the initial questions, which was around the West Bank. And so I'm trying to be as neutral and on the fence, very bad use of words when I ask my question, but it is on the fence as I possibly can. And that is the West Bank. And so today we have 500,000 Jews that live over the Green Line. So Rabbi Rich, my question to you is, in a world where you believe they shouldn't be there, what happens? Are we creating 500,000 Jewish refugees in 2020, 2021, 2022? So that's my first question. And then, Rabbi Altschuler, equally, the international community sees the West Bank as Palestinian territory. What right does a Jew have to live in Hebron, in Gush Etzion, anywhere over the Green Line? So, Rabbi Rich, as you volunteered, Rabbi Altschuler first, I'll volunteer you first for this one, Rabbi Altschuler, you can respond.
In an ideal world, Palestinians, as they are, by the way, could live very happily in the state of Israel. And in an ideal world, Jews, Jewish Israelis, whatever term you choose to use them, should be able to live in a Palestinian state. That is an ideal. We are. It seems to me that is not possible at the moment, and there's no point. It's all very well to have ideals, and of course we should have ideals. and the ideal might be, all sorts of different arrangements. But it seems to me that currently the settlements remain a major obstacle to a long-term peace solution. And if the price for genuine coexistence and peaceful living were the return of 500,000 Israelis to the 1967 borders or some other definition, then I think that is what would have to happen. Do I think it's likely to happen? No. Do I think it would be ideal if it did happen? Possibly. But I think in the meantime, there are other things that could be done that might enable both parties to see themselves in each other. I do think the current isolation of Gaza is a particular problem. I know that problem is a problem created by Egypt, by Israel, and by the current leaders in Palestinian leaders in Gaza. But it is as I haven't been to Gaza, I've only been to the border, but as I understand it, it is a powder keg that one day will explode. And when and if it explodes, there will be lots of victims, probably those who call themselves Palestinians and those who call themselves Israelis. And the more what I would call building measures, confidence building measures, that each party or other parties feel obliged to able to make, the closer we might get to seeing a resolution. If a resolution is possible, and I believe, because maybe I'm a naive idealist, I believe that the overwhelming majority of Israelis and the overwhelming majority of Palestinians want a peace with justice. And that's what they have to be working on together.
My response? I think Rabbi Rich proved my point, that the problem is that we have Western values that we're trying to impose into the Middle East. Because I disagree with you, everything that I have read and seen in that area, especially from the local press, the Palestinian press, is that the vast majority of Palestinians simply want the Jewish state to disappear. And I don't think that they share the same values as Israelis. And I've been in Israel across the country. I have rarely met any Israeli who didn't yearn for peace more than anything. But when I have spoken to Palestinians, and the one that I suggest that everybody listen to is the very eminent journalist, Bassem Eid. We're very good friends. He's a Palestinian journalist who lives in Jericho. He goes to Israel almost every day. His offices are there. He has many friends there, especially Natan Sharansky. But he's very committed to his people. He was in prison. He was imprisoned by the Palestinian Authority. He said, you guys in the West, you tell them they have it all wrong here. My people want jobs. They want to work in Israel. They want what the Jewish state has that they don't have. They want to get rid of their corrupt leaderships. And all you guys do in the West, you keep feeding them and feeding Abbas and feeding Hamas until it's an explosion there that the masses have no other choice.
You've just said two contradictory things. You just said, on the one hand, you say the Palestinians don't share our view. The reality is the Palestinians share exactly. You've just said it yourself. They have the same aspirations as Israelis.
Qassam Eid is a minority in terms of the political dynamics.
But he isn't a minority in terms of the Palestinians.
The political dynamics are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. There's no freedom of press there. Journalists are arrested randomly. I don't know why Western people aren't in arms about that. There will never be peace until the Palestinians, and you might say even the entire, we've seen movements in the Gulf states and part of the Arab world, but until the Palestinian Authority's leadership changes, Hamas gives up its covenant of bloodshed against Jews, and by the way, it's consistent with every war that's started there. Every war that's been started has been against Israel, and Israel's fought for its survival. I think it's very important for people to remember that between 1948 and 1967, when there was an armistice, there was no such thing as a 67 border. There was no peace agreement. That the Arab world had all the opportunities of creating 15 Palestinian states if they wanted. It's controlled by Jordan. There's no international recognition of any nation in that part of the world. And Jews lived there long before 1948 for hundreds of years, dating back to this 15th century.
The Arab world is also changed. You know, you speak as though the Arab world never changes. The Arab world has bigger fights amongst itself today, in many cases, than it does against Israel. So the world changes all the time. And this is where Israel and the Palestinians need to be nimble enough and flexible enough and intelligent enough to move with the world.
But Rabbi Rich, if you hear Abbas saying that no Jew will ever live in the West Bank and no Jewish dirty feet will ever walk on the Temple Mount, and Haifa and Tel Aviv belong to the Palestinian nation, and no Jew will be in Jerusalem. These are scary words.
Yeah, and the Israeli public ministers to talk about removing the Palestinian population. You know exactly. If you choose to listen, I'm not an apologist for Abbas. I'm not an apologist for Abbas. But we can always find extreme leaders, and use them. And you're right. He is the so-called elected president. He was elected, I think, 15 years ago, and hasn't had an election since.
Three-year term.
I'm not unaware or naive about Arab politics, but Israeli politics is hardly covering itself in glory at this particular moment. With Netanyahu, ducking and diving, admitting in a semi-democratic way, you might argue, to avoid his court cases. I mean, the problem is absence of leadership on both sides.
I don't make that moral equivalent. I don't think there's a comparison when you have a world leader saying, I want Haifa and no dirty Jewish feet on the Temple Mount. No matter what Netanyahu has said, and he's a human being too, whatever, but he's a democratically elected leader in Israel. There's been no bloodshed there, a lot of vitriol, a lot of verbiage. But this is
what did you say about Arabs going to the polls, so-called Israeli Arab citizens of Israel? What did you say about them going to the polls? You remember?
I remember that. It was a foolish.
I don't think a great Democrat.
Arab, and that's another point, by the way, you're just making my point, is that Arabs are living as citizens in Israel.
Yes.
They speak Hebrew. I've been with Arabs, and their Hebrew's better than most Israelis.
And you're going to tell me they have full equality and everything's hunky-dory, aren't you?
I'm not finished with that. No, they don't. But I can't think of any minority in any country that has full equality. Why the Jewish state is held up to a standard after 71 years of war against that world, to a stand. What I have seen with the relationship of Muslims, this might be surprising, because I've seen it in Beersheba, I've seen it elsewhere with Israeli troops, young kids, in all kinds of incidents. I've seen more integration in Israel of Muslims and Jews and Christians than in anywhere in the world. It's a mockery of Israel's brilliance.
Certainly more than anywhere in the Middle Eastern world. I agree with you. Listen, I'm not here to attack Israel. I think Israel has marvelous things about it. It's
I think it's very important.
It's one of the best in the world. It's integration of immigrants. Imagine when you think about a state with 1 million people that absorbed 4 million other people. I mean, we can't even take 21 Sudanese doctors into our country at this particular time. So there's lots about Israel that's positive and powerful and prophetic. But there are other aspects of it that need attention, and we should not be naive about that.
I think it's very naive to think that somehow if every Jewish settlement, by the way, there's a lot of misinformation about that too. 85% of the so-called settlements are rings around Jerusalem. We're talking at a very 2% of the territory in Judea and Samaria, West Bank. So very few live there. There are some pockets of communities. Gush Etzion was a Jewish community before 1948. It was completely massacred and destroyed. So there is room, obviously, for negotiation. The Arabs, the Palestinians, blew it on 2 occasions. They walked away. It's increased nervousness and fears, and I think rightfully so, of the Israeli population. They cannot afford to lose one war, not once. And so these are the demands upon the Israeli leadership there. I have full confidence in their people. I've seen these people. They love humanity. They're the first ones to help earthquake victims and tsunami victims and the coronavirus people. Their laboratories are in full steam right now, trying to find a cure for the entire world. I don't think anybody has to lecture the Israelis about what they've done for the world community in Africa.
I said that Zionism, like Judaism, fulfills many of the things about being a light unto the nations. So I'm not.
But I think we have to remember this one thing. You mentioned diaspora, galut history. I just finished a unit on 14th century Spanish Jewry. Completely annihilated over 2 centuries, the greatest center of the Jewish diaspora that ever existed. And then, of course, we move into modern history, how Jews were treated, and of course, the show we need
historical here. Israel, until the Roman period, Israel was Israel as a nation. It was effectively annihilated. So your history,
Yes.
Whether you live in one country or whether you live in your own country or whether you live in the diaspora, doesn't mean you don't get annihilated by somebody bigger than you. So I don't know what
I would put my bet that as long as there's a strong Israel, we will remain a strong diaspora and a strong Israel, because that's the only formula for Jewish survival. We've proven that in modern history. Jews were sitting ducks. My relatives in Eastern Europe and Russia face pogroms almost every week in their hometown. That's why my relatives left, as 4 million other Jews left. We can't tolerate that situation any longer. No longer. Never again. Those words are very true.
Anyway, I think our moderator wants to say something.
Yeah.
I think we can go to these points backwards and forwards. What I'd like to do now, with your permission, is there's like lots of questions being flying through in the chat room. I'd like people to just refire your questions, prioritize your most important question first. And yeah, it would be great to hear the questions from the chat room. It may take them a couple of seconds to catch up. There's a slight lag. So I'll scroll up while we're waiting and see if I can see any of the questions. So there's a lot of statements from Jonathan Hoffman, but they're not in a question format. So Jonathan has just posted a question, which is question to Rabbi Rich. Why did you remain a patron of the Zionist Federation when you did not accept the IRA definition of anti-Semitism?
Do you want me to answer?
Rabbi Rich, obviously no one has to answer any questions they don't want to answer.
The answer is, I am and remain a patron of the Zionist Federation, representing liberal Judaism. I'm proud to do so. I happen to believe that the IRA definition has some difficulties with it, but that is completely irrelevant to whether or not I'm a Zionist or the patron of the Zionist Federation. I know Jonathan Hoffman. Did he ask the question?
Yeah.
Has tried to remove me many times. And although he's not an advocate of democracy, because he's a thug, of course, but advocates of democracy will understand that
I think we should keep the personal stuff. That makes me uncomfortable.
Well, you should have seen the way he and his friends behaved towards me.
I would prefer that we.
Well, you may, but you're also being naive.
I've been Jonathan, and I disagree with you. So I really didn't want to say anything pro or con about any people. I think we should just keep it with them.
All right, let's try to stay away from ad hominems. And Jonathan Hoffman, I say you're responding in the chat. Please also if we're asking Rabbi Rich not to talk in camera, I'll ask you as well, please, Jonathan, in the comments to be respectful. Right. Anyway, so just to expand on that, what is it about the IRA definition that you find difficult, Rabbi Rich?
Well, there are some legal opinions which suggest that it can be used to restrict freedom of discussion. Now, I'm not wholly persuaded by that argument, but I have seen the legal opinions and bothered to actually read them. And if you read them, and they're by very prominent lawyers, they point out that not the definition itself, but that some of the examples which are attached to them would make debate difficult. For example, am I allowed to say that the Balfour Declaration arises out of colonial aspirations? You know? Or is that something that I'm not allowed to say, as an example?
So I believe you're not allowed, from memory, you're not allowed to say that Israel is a racist endeavor. Are you saying that Israel is a racist endeavor?
No, I didn't say that. I was very clear, didn't say that. What I said is it arises. The Balfour, and I used the word the Balfour Declaration, not the State of Israel. The Balfour Declaration arose out of colonial aspirations. Now,
whose colonial aspirations? The Jews.
They have to do with anti-Semitism.
I didn't say anything to do with anti-Semitism. What I'm saying is some people think that you can't say certain things in debates.
I never read that.
By the way, I have advised that the Labour Party and others that I'm involved with should sign the declaration. But is it a perfect document? No, it's not. Does it, in my view, have some challenges about it? Yes, it does. Would I, for the sake of pragmatism, sign it? Yes, I would.
Okay, thank you. That's a good answer. Hopefully, Jonathan, that answers your question. We've got another question from Aaron, which is to Rabbi Altschuler. And this question is, doesn't the nationhood law discriminate against Arabs in Israel?
The answer is not at all. If you read the declaration of the State of Israel, Israel has no constitution. And the attempt of this nationality law, which I think a lot was made of it, which was basically a repetition of what Israel has always advocated, and that this is a Jewish state that has an Arab minority that are citizens of the State of Israel, but it is a Jewish state. And I think that was terribly important to underscore that, because that was a major problem. I think that was, about 6-7 years ago. Palestinian Authority was having trouble going to the negotiating table because they couldn't recognize Israel as a Jewish state. So this law I happen to be in favor of. It didn't change anything, but it just underscored to the international community that Israel was going to remain a Jewish state, and the Arab fantasies of destroying that Jewish state just weren't going to happen.
Okay, so we've got another question. And I've been muting neo-Nazis this entire conversation. For some reason, neo-Nazis swarm to the Israel Advocacy Movement YouTube channel. And they've all been really disrespectful, except one of them who's just been sitting and watching, and they've asked their questions from the alt-right. So
let me just say, by the way, I apologize for the vocabulary I used about Jonathan. I would love to sit down with him and discuss things with him. But in our past experiences, he hasn't allowed me to do that.
So I'm happy to have a chat with Jonathan to see if I can facilitate that, because we are one people, and diversity of thought is actually a good.
I withdraw the comment I made and apologise, the particular word that I used, but some of his behaviour has not made it easy for him and I to have a discussion. Let me put it that way, and I would welcome the opportunity to have a discussion with him.
And
I would love to be there. Anything to make peace.
Yeah.
So people. The question from our ethno-nationalist in the chat room is, why the Jews, and you can answer this however you like, why the Jews, I think it was hate ethno-nationalism for others. So the implication being that in this person's view, Israel is an ethno-nationalist state. And so, ethno-national state. So either of you are welcome to pick up that question.
I'm not as familiar with these movements purposely, because I disdain them completely. You know, nationalism is I recommend everybody to read Chazoni's book on the need for nationalism. Nationalism, or like any ism in its extreme, can be horrible, as we've seen in the 20th century. But nationalism also, after World War I, became a hope for a lot of different national minorities. So extremism in any side, whether it be with ethno-nationalism, whatever that is, extremism on the left, are those things that I disdain the most, and which, by the way, I'm always trying to show the good spots in Israel. Israel has a nation state that cares about humanity, period, and it never has to apologize for its nationalism, because it's keeping the glue of a lot of people together and giving them hope. I don't know, maybe.
Let me coming back to what I think Rabbi Altschuler said earlier on about globalism. I must say that in an ideal world, I'm an advocate of internationalism and globalism. I think the nationalism can on the one hand be patriotism, which I think is a good thing, and on the other hand, it can be an exclusive form of arrogance. And those are the two extremes of nationalism, if you like. And I don't think nationalism is the most endearing of human qualities, but there is no doubt that many people like to associate with people who are like them in some way or another. And then the question is, well, who decides what is an appropriate nationalism, what isn't appropriate nationalism? You know, at one time, the Cornish nationalists wanted their own state in Cornwall. And Britain said no. Scotland now wants its own state in Scotland, and the United Kingdom, currently Scottish people say, but United. So I think nationalism has strengths when it's form of interest in one's culture, interest in one's history, interest in one's origin, interest in one's particular language, particular ways of doing things. But as Rabbi Altschuler reminds us, it also can end up in what I call an arrogant form of self-expression. And it isn't the most endearing of our qualities, of human qualities, in my view. But we live in a real world, not in an ideal world. We'd all like to live in an ideal world, but we live in a real world. And in a real world, countries have borders and divisions and immigration policies and all of the things which, in an ideal world, we might not choose to have or to need. And the question is how we operate all of those policies, which give rise for concern sometimes.
I would just very quickly add on to that, to the alt-right person. Israel isn't an ethno-national state. It has a much larger ethnic minority than the UK. There's a very diverse population. I don't think either of the rabbis would like to see that change. Most Israelis delight in the diversity of the nation. And so it's a misconception that Israel is an exclusively Jewish state. It isn't. We have one other question from someone called Reb Mordechai. And it's is the liberal rabbi, so I don't know which one this is. I'm assuming it's Rabbi Rich from the question. Is the liberal rabbi saying that all countries which were created by colonialism be dismantled, or just Israel? So first and foremost, were you saying that countries...
Well, that's not have you stopped beating your spouse type of question. I never called for Israel to be dismantled at any point, have I? Not throughout this discussion, have I? Or do I believe that Israel should be dismantled? In fact, if you read what I've written, you'll say that one of the things I say is no country should live under the constant threat of it being dismantled. So it's complete, have you stopped beating your spouse style of question. What I said was, we ought to be able to be mature enough to have a debate in which things that can offend others might need to be said, or at least discussed, even if we disagree with them. And for me, the question is Israel I think you asked the question, is Israel a racist state? Well, I don't think it is, personally. I think sometimes some of its behaviors come close, and most of the time they don't. But I wouldn't stop people having that debate on the basis it's anti-Semitic. As I wouldn't if they decided to ask if China is a racist state, probably more racist than Israel, or Saudi Arabia, or thousands of other countries around the world. What I'm concerned about is that for some reason, we Jews seem unable to have a relatively free debate anymore, without being accused of being an anti-Zionist, an anti-Semite, a self-hating Jew, a Corbynista, a momentum spook, or whatever term it is, or a rightist nutter, whatever it is. I want us to try and have as open a debate as we can in an intellectual sense, conscious that, of course, we have to be a bit careful that intellectualism doesn't become a tool by which thugs then carry out other types of behavior. But I want to have a more open conversation. And I think sometimes the community is in danger of closing conversations and not opening them. And the thing I like about this particular thing that you've done tonight is you've got two rabbis who don't agree on everything clearly, despite being very good friends and having been polite to each other. We've got people who've attacked me, certainly, and asked me questions, and I've responded in a robust way. Admittedly, I was not careful in my language in one of them, and I've apologized and withdrawn that. And that's the types of debates we ought to be able to have without accusing each other of certain belonging, of putting onto people certain things which may or may not be true. So I've never, ever supported or called for the dismantling of the State of Israel, ever.
I would second Danny's remarks that this is a tremendous forum and we need more dialogues like this with mutual respect, even though we disagree on a variety of issues here. My only thing, though, is if we don't, in my opinion, if we don't understand the erosion of support for Israel as the country, as it is, with all of its blemishes and whatnot, there's no perfect place in the world. We all of Jews, I believe, have a tremendous responsibility to know our history, to know what's at stake here. And I believe that if we do not start letting our young generation know why Israel came to be, what it's facing in the world today, what it represents in terms of our biblical values, beginning with Abraham, we were called upon to be a special nation, a special people to the rest of the world. And I don't want Israel to be an island unto itself. We have to work extra hard, in my view, really hard, to start supporting Israel more than ever before. Otherwise, one day, just like with Corona, we never know, and I think Rabbi Rich said, we never know what's going to happen tomorrow. Two things could happen. Our world could be shattered overnight. Or, on the other hand, which I happen to be a proponent of, I never give up on humanity. My hope still is that the visions of Solomon and the temple in Jerusalem, I still adhere to those, the visions of our prophets, that one day there will be a change in the world. But I do not believe we're going to get there if we allow violence and threats against the Jewish people to continue to mount and mount until we have a struggle that we can't rectify any longer. That's my view.
Well, Stuart, let me say this. I do think if we don't allow an opening of the debate, in fact, the reverse, or what you fear might happen, will happen even more. I think young people do not understand, and others don't understand, when people say you can't talk about that. Of course, you shouldn't advocate violence, but I am very concerned, not only in Jewish community but elsewhere, about what I call a lack of respect for freedom of speech. That of course you shouldn't be advocating violence. But if I want to say that Saudi Arabia is a misogynist state, for example, which I think it is, actually, I don't want something to say, well, that's against British interests, therefore you can't say it. Or it's anti, I don't know. We ought to be able to, and I think we are in danger. Now, I might be a naive 19th century liberal thinker, or whatever the term that might be used against me. But I do think if we close debate by accusing people, and you haven't done it, of course, I'm not suggesting you do, by accusing people of certain crimes, whether that's anti-Semitism or self-hatred, all of this stuff, we risk people becoming suspicious, and we risk people really making proper assessments of what they need to make.
But I would think this is a very important distinction here. If I say that Saudi Arabia is a misogynist state, which I also agree with that, nobody is calling for an elimination of Saudi Arabia. The difference with Israel and the Jewish people, it's only how many years after the Shoah, is that there's a very distinct movement, the BDS movement. It's really calling for the dismantlement, the illegality of Israel, dismantle it hook, line, and sinker completely. It's the only country in the world that gets 85% support of the nations of the United Nations to see it eliminated. Iran is the only nation state since the founding of the United Nations that has called for the complete eradication of a member United Nations state. Where are the voices? Why isn't the UN throwing them out of the United Nations? What happened to our values?
I'm not a great advocate for the United Nations. I think it has some value, but I'm not values, but it has some values and some value. I agree. It always strikes me as slightly ironic that on the Human Rights Council you get Saudi Arabia and other countries
Syria
in charge of it. So I'm not disagreeing with you in that sense.
But the Jewish people have been.
Listen, I think it would be perfectly legitimate for somebody to make an argument to say most of the countries of the Middle East are the result of British and French colonialism, including Iraq.
Correct.
Not Iran, by the way, including Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, probably Lebanon.
Jordan.
I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to say in a certain context. Now, I'm not advocating, by the way, as I've never advocated the destruction of the state of Israel or dismantling, whatever the term is. I'm not advocating dismantling of Lebanon or Syria or Iraq. Well, I might actually, because you might want to divide it to Kurdish and other parts. But what I'm saying is ideas need to thrive if we possibly can, because the alternative is that people believe whatever the last thing they saw. And if people don't challenge either way, we're in danger. And I think our society is in much danger of restricting debate and what that will lead to, as some of the other fears that you rightly have, or you rightly hold, I should say, whether I agree or not is irrelevant, about the existence of the state of Israel.
So can I ask a question on that? Can I just ask a question on that? Because it's one of the things that obviously has been coming up a lot in the questions that are firing through, and that is the Jeremy Corbyn. Rabbi Rich, you endorsed or backed Jeremy Corbyn, as I understand it. You attended the Judas Seder. Is that tied into?
You just made two statements which are untrue.
Okay, so that's why I said I believe. I just want to answer, please. So correct me on what actually happened, but are those associations and the hosting of people that the others in the community perceive to be controversial? Is that born out of a place of what you're discussing here, of freedom of speech and diversity of thought, or is it something else? And so, yeah, really interesting.
So let me be clear, because I've made public on at least a number of occasions that I voted against Jeremy Corbyn to be the Labour Party twice. More than most other Jews in this country, because they left after the first vote. So when I'm accused of being a Jeremy, whatever that means, however, so that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is I never attended a Judas Seder.
So the JVL, they said. Sorry,
what I did do was I was asked whether I would host and do some Jewish teaching and run a Seder for 4 groups, one of which was Jewish Voice for Labour. I happen to believe that that these people, the members of the Jewish Voice for Labour and the other groups, which was the Jewish Socialist Group and the Jewish Friends of something, I don't know what it was, I have not discovered amongst them anti-Semites. I've discovered amongst them Jews with various levels of Jewish knowledge. And I believe I was right to host a Seder, which had more than 200 family units involved, from countries as diverse as Israel, Palestine, South Africa, Spain, Greece, and elsewhere. And I do not believe, unlike some parts of the Jewish community, that when the evil child turns up at the Seder, you throw them out the door. Quote, I don't say these people are evil children, but if that's the definition other people have, they're Jews. And if they're Jews, they're entitled to a Jewish education. And leading a Seder, as far as I'm concerned, is part of my Jewish education, a part of my role as a Jewish educator. And I believe the community has done itself no favors in seeking to divide the community between good Jews and bad Jews. Now, they accuse Jeremy Corbyn of doing that. I suggest very often it's the Jewish established community that has chosen to do that. But be that as it may, it's not really relevant. I am prepared to educate Jews. I don't ask them their level of observance, which denomination they belong to, what their politics are, and what they believe or don't believe.
Is there a line for you that is too far? So a certain person you wouldn't.
Well, I'll give you another example. I went into a prison a few weeks ago to teach a person who committed 2 murders. That's my responsibility as a Jew, and as a rabbi, and as a chaplain. I don't judge people always on what they've done in the past, what they say they're going to do. Now, I accept that's not popular with large parts of the Jewish community. It's also publicly known that I invited Jeremy Corbyn to Friday night dinner, and I did so because I wanted him to meet a religious Jewish family. And he did, and he was very gracious about it. We can have long debates about Jeremy Corbyn. He's no longer the leader of the Labour Party. Should there be any doubt, I voted for Keir Starmer in this election. But that's all completely irrelevant to the fact that just because somebody says they're a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn doesn't make them less Jewish, dare I say it, than Rabbi Altschuler or me. Because somebody says they're a member of Momentum or of the Labour Party, or indeed of even the Socialist Workers' Party, which I happen to not like very much. If they're Jewish and they want a Jewish education, I'm happy to talk to them. And more than that, I think it needed more voices to try and build bridges. And unpopular though that was, that's what I tried to do. And maybe I've ended up being trusted by nobody, and that's the risk I took and what I'm prepared to do, because I believe that's what liberal rabbis should be doing. They should be at the margins, bringing Jews in, educating Jews, trying to work to build the Jewish community, the strength of the Jewish community as a whole, not only their own little bit of it.
So I like a lot of what you said. I have a friend who I learned with in yeshiva, who's now a spokesperson for Neturei Karta. He's still part of the same nation as me. He probably considers me an Apicorus, a heretic, but that's fine. I agree with that. What I would ask one final question then, I'm happy for you guys to take more questions from the group or to end it there, but I guess my final question, and it's related to that, because I just find it really, for me personally, and I'm supposed to be neutral and not joining in as much, but I can't help myself. Do you ever worry that you provide people who do pose threats to the Jewish community in terms of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, which certainly does exist? The Labour Party itself has admitted it has a problem with anti-Semitism. Do you ever worry that you, by being the go-to rabbi for these people, that you provide cover for people who pose some sort of threat to the Jewish community within the UK?
Yeah, if I know it's for Rabbi Rich, but I've been sitting on the sidelines. I don't want to get involved in any of his personal decisions for them. I just disagree. I think, for example, when I see certain figures in the United States coddling or associating with Louis Farrakhan, who's made some pretty virulent statements about Jews, I think there has to be some bottom line here. I personally wouldn't even come close to inviting Jeremy Corbyn to my home, because he has supported violence. He has been an advocate for Iran. He is not. He has said Hezbollah and Hamas should be friends of ours. I have limits, and I think because Israel is, in a sense, a very important ideological, cultural, and religious war for its survival, that we must be very careful about giving any sanction to those groups of people, and from different angles, who have hostile attitudes, both to wanting to destroy Israel and to the what I would consider to be the very survival of Jewish people. So I have a different view of that, and I'm a very liberal person. I reach out to. I've been one of the first advocates of reaching out to the Muslim community. Danny Rich knows me. I believe in that, but I do have a bottom line that's very core to me. And I think it's also becoming very important for our people to have those bottom lines as well. So we disagree.
Well, I'm not sure that we disagree. But first of all, Jeremy Corbyn can defend himself. It's not for me to defend him. My argument was that he, and it's a consistent argument, he was the leader of Her Majesty's opposition, like it or not. He very nearly became our prime minister a short while ago, and it was not wise for the Jewish community to be in constant conflict with him. Whoever's fault it was, I'm not talking about whose fault it was, but that's how it is, and that phase is now past. The Labour Party is led by an entirely different person now. I have always believed that the Labour Party and my Jewish values are close. They're not always lined up and exactly the same. I'm hoping that under Keir Starmer, more Jews will feel that the Labour Party meets some of their aspirations. That's a matter for them. I also happen to have lots of friends who are conservatives, some who are Jewish and some who are not Jewish. They're all very decent human beings, lovely people, many of them. And I'm very clear. I will criticize what people say, and I'll criticize their policies, but I never criticize them or their motivations, because I don't know what their motivations are. So that and I've worked with politicians across all political parties. Some I've disagreed with more, and some I've disagreed with less. But if it's in the interests of the Jewish community, or it's in the interest of society at large, to work with people in certain positions, I believe very often that's the right thing to do. However, I'm not here seeking to defend myself. The question you asked was, am I providing cover for anti-Semites and people who want to seek the destruction of Israel? I'm certainly not providing cover for anti-Semites. I don't know any Jewish anti-Semites. I'm sure there are some, but there might be some. There could be some, I don't know. I don't know how you'd be a Jewish anti-Semite, I suppose. But anyway, I've never met one. So let me put it that way. And I certainly know that some of the Jews that I work with are non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist. And some of them may even take unbalanced views vis-a-vis Israel, which I will seek to challenge. The difference is I go to churches which are so-called anti-Zionist. I go to student union meetings which are supposed to be anti-Israel. And I stand up and defend Israel in those circles. And I'm often at been at student meetings when somebody pops up and says, gives me a diatribe of why Israel is terrible. And I happen to know, usually, I have a good guess that they're a member of the Gay Society. So I simply say to them, would you prefer to be gay in Damascus, Gaza City, or Tel Aviv? And their immediate response is, that's not the question, Danny. That's not what you're supposed to be answering. I said, well, I'm just wanting to point out to you, you've given a whole list of things about why Israel is so terrible. And all I want to tell you is there are things about Israel that don't make it so terrible. And there are things about the countries which you seek to defend, which are terrible. So that the irony that somehow I'm this left-wing mother eagle under the wings of which anti-Semites and anti-Zionists and destroyers of Israel and Jeremy Corbyn can be fed and nurtured. I wish it were true. But I'm a rabbi. I was for 15 years the leader of the liberal Jewish community. I was never challenged on most of that. I represented the movement effectively, I think. I'm now a freelance educator, and therefore I can spread my wings a little further than I did before, ironically.
We can take more questions. There's a lot in the chat, but we are already at 87 minutes of this. So it's completely, the ball is in your court, rabbis. I'm happy to bring this to its conclusion, or I'm also happy to take questions, whichever you.
I'm okay. I'm fine.
Have a little bit more then.
Okay, so I'm just going to scroll up to the first question. There's a lot of them. Bear with me.
Maybe there's one for Stuart for a change.
Yeah, I'm sitting here on the side.
There's a lot for you, Rob. Here we go. It's not really progressive, but it's very controversial. So I'll ask it, Stuart. So this is from Alex. Alex, who mentioned before, he's one of the 25 under 25. So it's a good question from a future leader. And that is, does Stuart support gay rights, and would he marry a gay couple? Nothing to do with the subject, but it is addressed to you, Rob. question.
This is off subject. The gay rights. My view is that we have in our congregation, a lot of our leaders, people come. It's not an issue. It shouldn't be an issue. They are Jews. They are part of the Jewish community. It's very important to protect their dignity, their respect, their privacy. You say privacy, we say privacy, and all those things. We've come a long way in our society, and I'm very proud of that. There are, in our movement, there is ample permission to officiate at gay weddings. I've done so only on one occasion, but that doesn't mean I would turn anyone down. So that's my answer. I don't think that's an issue at all for me entirely. Period.
Okay, and so Rabbi Rich, over to you. And that is, what does Rabbi Rich feel about those Jews who said Kaddish for Hamas? Does he feel more kinship to them than he does the Jews who live in the West Bank?
Well, this is another style. Have you had a meeting yourself yet? Kaddish was never said for Hamas. That's the first thing. Kaddish was said for dead Palestinians. That's the difference. And of course, propaganda, which and this, I'm not saying this person may have misunderstood what happened because of the way it was reported, but and I wasn't present, and I personally wouldn't have been present. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't support other people doing things. If those people in good conscience, as Jews, and some of them were Zionists too, felt it appropriate to say Kaddish for Palestinians, to make a point that Palestinians and Israelis are equally valued, both by their families and by God, and the death of them are equally tragic. It's not the way that I would have chosen to do it, but I respect people's right to do it. But the idea that it was a Kaddish for Hamas is a nonsense.
So I was like,
for dead Palestinians.
I was there, so I did film that. And while it wasn't originally set up as Kaddish for Hamas, it was set up for the people who died at the fence in Gaza. It was released on the morning. Hamas came out and named 50 of the people who were killed as members of Hamas. And so there were many people who were present who will have known that. I'm sure there were many others present that were oblivious to that piece of information, but there certainly were, and they went through the list of names and named each person, which is why people made the association. But I'm sure, like you say, there will have been people there.
But the first point is, it wasn't a Kaddish for Hamas, it was a Kaddish for dead Palestinians. It may be that all or some or many of the Palestinians were members of Hamas. By the way, because people are members of Hamas doesn't mean that they're not naive people brought along in stupidity. Many people, as we know, in all sorts of situations, end up in situations they shouldn't be in because they're naive, not because they're necessarily evil. Their conduct is clearly evil, no doubt about it. But many people, I work in prisons and special hospitals as a Jewish chaplain. There are many people there who've been led by others, led by their own voices they hear, led by all sorts of circumstances to commit terrible crimes. It doesn't mean if a prisoner dies in prison, I'm asked to say Kaddish, I'd say, well, I'd happen not to like their offence, so I won't. And if it were a Jewish terrorist, or I wouldn't be dealing with any other terrorist. But if it was somebody committed of an offence was considered terrorist, and they were Jewish, and I was asked to say Kaddish, I would say it. It's not for me. It doesn't mean I approve of their behaviour. But the problem these days is we look at the headlines. So, are you for Kaddish for Hamas, or are you against? Answer: neither. Do I think it's appropriate for some people to feel in their Jewish conscience they should be saying Kaddish for Palestinians as a way of raising the issue? I wouldn't do it personally, but I defend their right to do so.
And the second part of that question was kinship. Do you have more kinship to those British Jews that are on the left that you would say were maybe involved in social justice and saying Kaddish for dead Palestinians, or to Jews that are living in the West Bank, in places like Hebron, in places...
I have kinship with individuals rather than groups.
Yeah. Okay.
So So I know people who are very right wing whom I happen to be fond of. Can't not be fond of them, even though I detest their policies, perhaps, or but don't like what they say or think or do, and that would apply to people on the left. So I don't feel any more kinship for one group of Jews than another. I won't say any more now. That'll do.
If I could just say, I was horribly offended by that Kaddish, whatever. I don't know the specifics of it, but first of all, Kaddish is a very sacred prayer that we recite for the Jewish dead. And this was especially offensive because Israel was fighting at that time to protect its borders. And the people who died in that conflict were people who were attempting to storm the border and being part of Hamas's agenda for all the reasons. There are stupid ones, naive ones, and ideological ones. I thought it was terribly offensive to the Jewish people, to the state of Israel, especially at that time, at this particular time when Israel's fighting for its very integrity as a country and borders. And I see there's a tendency to run, as I mentioned in my open remarks, to be worried about everybody else, the victim, and forgetting who the victim is in that part of the world. The victims, Jews never use that excuse. We build cities and hospitals and schools, and we don't care about being victims anymore. But this victimhood fed right into that. It was wrong. It was offensive, and I thought it was a terrible blow to what is really going on in the Middle East. I was very offended by it.
Okay. Yeah.
Stuart, I could challenge you and say, why don't you say you didn't know much about it and suddenly you're very offended by it? Well,
Well, what I read in the newspaper about, I read enough from the rabbis that were involved to know.
Well, did you speak to one of them? Did you speak to one of the rabbis? Did you speak to one of them?
I didn't speak to any of the rabbis, no.
Well, they're our colleagues.
I understand. But there are a lot of things that colleagues do that I don't particularly approve of, and that's my own personal view. I took great offense at it.
Okay.
Personal view. Okay. And I think we're out of questions. There's just lots of questions repeating themselves. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank both of you. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to you and understanding both your perspectives. I had you both wrong, which is very refreshing. I think it's been really positive to have dialogue. I think it's been far calmer on the live stream than it has been in the chat room, which is definitely a good thing.
That's not our fault.
And so, yeah, I'd like to thank you both for taking time out. I'd like to ask everyone who's watching on the live stream, please make sure you subscribe to the channel, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Danny. I always learn from you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Keep well, be safe, both of you.
Everybody, and stay well, stay healthy.
Okay. So